All right, so we're gonna mess around with the fourth dimension, and we're gonna make ourselves a hypercube, but not just any hypercube. It's a hypercube that folds in on itself in an infinite thingy. It's super weird, super trippy, but it's super fun, and you're gonna learn a few things about Cinema 4D. Let's get started. All right, so before we hop into like the tutorial, I do want to talk a little bit about the fourth dimension. So, we live in a three-dimensional world, right? We got XYZ as our axes, and that's literally all we can see. Like, our brain cannot perceive anything above fourth dimension. People tend to think that the fourth dimension is time, and like while time is a dimension and is the fourth one that we can like experience, I guess. The fourth dimension in this particular case refers to not just up and down, left and right, and forward and backwards. There's like a fourth perpendicular dimension. And the weird part is that we literally, as humans, cannot perceive it. It doesn't make sense to us because we just literally cannot. We're just three-dimensional objects, our beings, and we just can't see it. So I find that really weird, and I think about that a little bit too much. Alright, so to make a hypercube, what you want to do is model a hypercube. And it's actually surprisingly easy to make, so I'm just going to go ahead and walk you through the process of making it. And maybe you'll learn a few modeling tricks along the way. So let's go ahead and create a cube. We more or less want to create a cube within a cube. So if we go here to X-ray, you can kind of see that there's a cube on the inside. Also, I'm not a huge fan of this floor plane, so I'm just going to go ahead and remove that. And so now we got ourselves a nice little clean working environment. All right, so let's go ahead and hit C, which will then turn it into editable geometry. We'll go ahead and select all of the faces, which are 6, and we'll hit MT for extrude. So if you just kind of pull it, it'll basically just make it bigger. It's what you want to do is go here to preserve groups and uncheck that, which then will then create this effect, which is what we're going for. Since the cube itself is 200, we're just going to give it an offset of 200, and we're going to extrude it. But if you notice on the inside, there is all these open faces, and since this thing is going to be turning inside out and all this other stuff, we want to make sure that we create caps. There's going to be a point where those inside walls are going to be on the outside, and if they're not there, it's just going to look weird. Okay, cool. So now that we got that going, I'm going to turn off X-ray again. And what we want to do here is we want to connect these 3 points. We want it to basically be in the middle where this point is. And so the way to do that is by hitting M and then hitting Q. And this creates the weld tool. And so now you can see that it creates like this virtual point here and creates this kind of cool looking shape. But yeah, if we go and do the rest, you'll see that it starts kind of forming something. What exactly? Who knows? Let's go ahead and just keep going. This part, I don't know, I find really fun because it's kind of seems like weird, but when you see the final product, you're like, oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So let's go ahead and keep doing it. We got two more of these to go. Cool. We have another cube, but this is a cool cube because this guy is a hypercube. So let's go ahead and create ourselves a atom array, okay? And we're going to drop in our cube inside of that. And so you can see that there's a cube within a cube, and also all these things are connected to each other, which is really nice. So now the next thing is, how do we manipulate this object so that all the points can basically be folded in on themselves? So what we're going to do, we're going to rename our cube to Hypercube, and then we're going to want to select just any random point. And we want to connect this to a null. So like, how do you do that? And it's actually surprisingly simple. With this point selected, you want to hit Shift-C, and then you want to type in cluster. Go down here to create cluster. And so what it does is that it creates this new null. It also puts this like cluster object inside of the cube, but basically it gives you the ability to manipulate the point of the cube with a null. And that's going to be very important going forward. But unfortunately, the issue with doing this is that we have to do each point individually. And so there's 16 points, so it can be a little tedious. However, it's actually very quick in hindsight, or like it just seems annoying, but once you kind of do it, it's fine. If anybody knows how to do it like in a smart way, where like I could just do it automatically, I'd love to know, but I currently do not know how to do that. So I'm just going to do it the hard way. Let's go ahead and rotate over. Shift C, cluster, and over here. Cool. So now we have the inside points, or sorry, the outsides. So yeah, each corner has a null. So now let's go ahead and move into the inside. And so if yeah, I'm not going to be able to select it because it's the cube itself is stopping me from clicking inside of it. So over here in your attributes, you want to select this visible only and get rid of it. And so now you can actually click inside. So go ahead and create a new cluster. And we're just going to keep doing this for the remaining. Let's select this guy. Oops. Over here. And since we already kind of like typed it in, basically it'll just stay here, and all you have to do is just hit enter. And yeah, basically it feels, that's like the quickest you're going to be able to do it, I guess. Okay. And we got 2 more to go. Hypercube. Shift C, enter. And let's go ahead and select the last one. Shift C, enter. Okay, cool. So let's do a little bit of cleaning up here. Also, let's make sure that we all the points got it, which it looks like they do. Let's go ahead and hit Shift C, and we're going to go into our naming tool. Cool. And so what we want to do here is we want to replace the word null with a number, and we want it to go from 0 to 15. So if we go here, we type in null, and we replace it with $ and capital N, and then you hit enter. Actually, you have to hit replace name, and so now it goes from 0 to 15, which is 16 objects. Cool. So if you want to like kind of test them, you can just kind of move it around, and you can see that it's working. Cool. So now what we want to do is, how do we make these sort of like rotate on it themselves? Because we basically want to create like circles where they kind of go in and out, and it kind of just creates that weird sort of tunneling, folding effect. So what we're going to want to do is do it with a cloner. So let's go ahead and create a new cube, and we're going to go ahead and create a cloner. Let's go ahead and drop in our cloner, but we need to put it somewhere, and the best place to put it is on an edge, but not just any edge. We need a spline. So if we grab this particular edge, which creates this nice little shape, we can then go into edge to spline, and so all the edges that you selected will now be turned into a spline, which you can see right here. I'll go ahead and go object mode and move it, and so you can see that there is in fact a spline there. And so if we go here to our cloner and we change it to object and drop this guy in here, we activate it, you'll see that there's a lot of things being cloned onto it. It defaults to count, but let's go ahead and just put 4. And if you notice, there are weird things happening. There is not 4 objects, there are 7. So that means that something's going on. If we go here to vertex, we can see that there's a lot of clones kind of stacked on top of each other, which means that there's some splines, some spline points that we need to address. So let's go ahead and hide this guy and go into our point mode, and with our selection thing, make sure that you reactivate visible only, because if you select all of them and then delete them, yeah, it's just going to delete the whole thing. But if you notice, there's a lot of a lot of these points sort of just in here. Okay, cool. So yeah, let's just go ahead and just keep clicking until it disappears. Click, click, Okay. Delete, 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 and okay. Go here. So if we go to our spline and hit close, it will then recreate the same shape as before, but with less points. So let's go ahead and check it. And we can see that there are now 4 objects. And if we switch over to from vertex to count, and it continues to be 4. So that means that we have cleaned it up and it now has the correct number of points. Cool. So now what we want to do is we want to actually make 4 of these. And well, the easiest way to do it is select it, go over to your rotation tool, and while rotating it, you want to hold down Control. It'll make a copy of it, but also if you do Shift, it'll then move it in increments of 5. So you want to move it 90 degrees. Let's do it again. 90. And let's do it one more time. 90. And so if you notice, it lands basically where all of the clusters are. And that's very important. Cool. All right. We also want to do a couple of things here, because if you notice, they're just like dots. We want to make them a little bit easier to find. So if you go here to the shape of it, you can actually give it a circle shape. And this will be much easier to select than all these other things that we're going to need to do later. We also want to connect all of 4 of the splines into a single spline. So select all 4 of them and hit connect objects and delete. And so now we have ourselves one big spline made up of 4 segments. Here in our cloner, we want to go back to object and drop this guy into here. And so now you can see that there are 16 clones. This is set to count, which is nice. But basically the reason we want to use a cloner for this is because if we go down here to rate and hit play, you'll notice that they all move together along the spline, which is really nice. I'm gonna give myself some extra frames to work with. And yeah, so like, how do we get our cluster points onto the cloner so that they move along the spline? You know, like the hard way would be to put an aligned spline on each one of these clusters and just assign it to this thing. It opens up a lot of like garbage, and you don't want to do that. And also it's 16 tags. It's also 16 keyframes that you're gonna have to deal with. Like, you don't really want to deal with that. You want something that's like procedural and gives you a lot of flexibility. And the cloner is basically the best tool for that, because yeah, it gives you not only the ability to put exactly the amount, but also, you know, you can mess around with the offsets. You can give it a speed. You know, it's like it's all built in, and it's really nice. It's very convenient. But the issue is that when we put in our clusters inside of the cloner, it doesn't really do anything. Like, they're moving, but they're not really moving. You know, they're like still frozen in their place. So how do we grab the information from the cloner, specifically the position data of each one of the clones? And that's where we have to get into Xpresso. There's a really cool little node in there that you can play around with. So if you create a new null, this is going to be kind of where all of our Xpresso stuff is going to happen. So let's go ahead and call this guy. I'm going to call it point controller, because basically it's going to control all of these clusters. You know, maybe cluster controller would be a little bit more accurate. Cluster controller. Cool. And so let's also go ahead and put in an Xpresso tag. And so now we got ourselves our little canvas for making stuff. The first thing you're going to want to bring in is a cloner. And we can also bring in this cluster controller, because ultimately all of the Xpresso nodes are going to tie directly into the cluster. But we'll get to that. I'll walk you through every step. Okay, cool. So in order to pull out data from the cloner, what you want to do is look for this thing called a data node. And so here, this data node can basically extract a lot of information from cloners, or I think pretty much anything that generates stuff. So what you want to do on the cloner is hit this little red button and activate object. And here you can just pull this in and create an object. Cool. So now we're telling this thing is like, this is the object I need you to look at. And so now what we want to do is kind of more or less create like the sort of cache that a cloner looks at whenever it's whenever it's like making clones. So when you look at a cloner, it has this like iterate, right? Or random, but what we want to do is iterate. So if you put in a bunch of different objects, it'll go down that list and it'll select them based on where they are in that list. So we want to make this cluster controller into a similar list. And the best way to do that is by creating what is called a hierarchy. So here in our hierarchy, everything that's inside of this null will basically be treated as the objects inside of a cloner. But the difference is that it's not going to create clones of it. It's basically just anything that's inside of it will tie it to a clone. And so unfortunately, you can't just like go ahead and like connect it like that. Oh, also, just before I forget, whenever you create a hierarchy tag, it automatically chooses the null that it, or to the object that it is connected to. In this case, it's our cluster controller. But if it doesn't say that, or if you're using a different thing, just make sure that whatever object, whatever null, whatever is going to be holding all of your cluster nulls, that's the one you want it to reference. So right here in reference, make sure that this one is here when you click on hierarchy. Yeah, so since you can't really plug it in, there's this thing we need to do to it, and that's an index. So whenever clones work, every time they kind of like get generated, they are assigned a number, and that's its index number. And you can actually see what these index numbers look like, or which object is which index, by going here to transform and here in display, go down to index. And so now you'll see these numbers appear on the clones. So this is clone 0, clone 1, 2, 3, you know, and basically all the way up to 15. So we want to assign these numbers to our hierarchy by basically giving them indexes. So easiest way to do it is just type in index. And it creates this object index. You can then drop this into there. And so now everything from inside of here passes through this index and is assigned a number. And then from here, it creates an index, which then we can plug into our data node. So what's basically happening is that the same sort of logic of the cloner is now being applied to this null. But now we need to know what to do with it. You know, like where do we send this information to? So in our data, we want to extract our position data. So we got ourselves position. I'll go ahead and remove these other ones. Actually, I can't delete them. So anyways, and here in our cluster, we want to activate two properties. One is object, and the other one is in global position. Global position. Cool. So now what we want to do is we want to connect the position to global position. And here in our index, we want to grab this instance and plug it into object. So now, if we follow the logic on this, the hierarchy inside of the cluster is then being pushed in here to give it an index number. The cloner automatically gives it an index, so it's pushing it directly through. It's looking at the cloner, and it's looking at this, and then basically it turned this cluster controller null into sort of like a container of sorts, where everything inside of it will be manipulated by the cloner. So if you want to see an example of it, I'm just going to turn off this cube, and I'm going to just bring in, let's see, like a capsule. And if I drop it inside the cluster controller, you can see that it automatically snaps to the position of, index 0. And then if I make another copy of it, this one moves to 1, and then, you know, so on and so forth. So what we want to do is put our clusters inside of this guy in the correct order so that they connect to the correct one. Because if we were to just grab all of them and just drop them in here, you don't see anything because this guy is deactivated, but you can see that it is just all over the place, and that's not going to work for us. So let's go ahead and undo that. Let's make sure we're still seeing this. Cool. And let's go ahead and start putting this in the correct order. So if you remember, I asked you to give them a display shape of a circle. And that's because it makes it much easier to select when you're looking for them, instead of trying to like select each one individually. And so it just makes it a little easier to find. So let's go ahead and start with 0. Okay, let's go ahead right there. So on index 0, the closest cluster to it is 6. So let's go ahead and drop that in there. You're not going to notice anything change because, you know, they're not moving anywhere. But if you want to see something, it already has a rate, so you can go ahead and press play. And so you can kind of see it doing its thing. Obviously, we want to do that to all of them. So let's go ahead and find 1, which is this guy. And we want to find 2, which is over here. Okay. And 3. So this one. Cool. So now when I hit play, you'll see that all 4 of them are going, which is fun. Okay. Okay, so now 4 is over here. Let's go ahead and select 4. We want 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and 11. So now we got our last set to do, which is 11, 12. So we got 12 over here. We got 13. We got 14. Okay, 14. And finally our 15. Okay, cool. So now if you press play, you'll see that it does the thing. And it looks cool, except that it is kind of linear and kind of sharp and kind of ugly. So we want to make some adjustments here, but more or less we're pretty much done. We don't really need to keep certain things open. We can definitely get rid of the cloner just by hiding it. Same thing with the splines. Actually, no, we're going to need the splines. We can also hide the cluster. So with our Hypercube spline here, let's go ahead and hide the atom array. It's set to linear, so it kind of creates that perfect shape. But we want to round it out. So what we're going to do is we're going to go over here to type, and we're going to change it from linear to Bezier, and it kind of creates this nice little rounded look. So let's go ahead and reactivate our atom array, and so we can see it. Unfortunately, it kind of creates this really weird sort of motion, which can look cool, but it's just not doing the thing that I want it to do, which is I wanted to make that original shape, the cube within a cube. So like when I go to linear, I wanted to create that shape. Like every time it rotates, I wanted to create this sort of cube within a cube look, and then rotate, cube within a cube. But so how do we do that in a sort of like cleaner and more appealing way of looking at it? Well, we can go to Bezier. And so the reason it looks like this is because the intermediate points are set to adaptive. So there's more points along like places where it's bent, and less in like the straight areas, which kind of creates inconsistent sort of points. And so you kind of want something that's more consistent. So your first, instinct might be to go to uniform. And it kind of does the thing, but here's the issue that I have with it, is that every once in a while, it kind of creates this sort of like flat look to it, and it never recreates that original shape, Actually, let me make sure I go there. It never creates that original shape. And for me, that's really important. I think that's what sells this effect. So let's go ahead and change it back to Bezier. And instead of uniform, let's go ahead and change it to natural. And what natural does is that it, gives it like a nice sort of flow to it, but it also kind of recreates that center point while also kind of like rounding it out, being smooth. And so like if you want it to be even smoother, you can just increase this number, and so now it looks very clean. Cool. And so yeah, like it slows down when it needs to slow down, and it speeds up when it needs to speed up to create that shape. And I think that's really awesome. Cool. So yeah, we're basically done here. And so you can kind of play around with it and see what it does. And yeah, you have all of the controls of the cloner. So you can make it go really fast. You can also mess around with the rate, the variation of it, which looks really weird. And also, if you don't want to like do a rate, you can basically just keyframe the offset. But also, if you mess around with the start and stop, it kind of creates this cool like unfolding effect, which I think is pretty neat. But obviously, you know, do whatever you want. I personally just like this rate thing. Okay, cool. So on the Hypercube, if you select the geometry and type in instance, it'll create a cube that is also folding in on itself, which is pretty nice. The reason I did it in this particular case is because I find it really cool when the walls are like glass. And so when they're like folding in on themselves, there's like this sort of like film to it. So here you can kind of go into, actually, sorry, I need to activate Redshift first. Go over here to Redshift, and then go over here to create Redshift materials. Let's go ahead and create a standard, and we're just going to drop it onto this guy. And what we want to do is here in transmission, just crank it all the way up. And here in the viewport, you can kind of see what it's doing. It's, you know, it's creating like a little bit of reflections. But if we go into our Redshift viewer, and before I press play on this, I'm going to drop in a light. So let's go ahead and grab an area light, bring it up, and rotate it. 90 degrees, cool. Let's make it bigger and push it up even higher. Okay, let's go ahead and hit play. And so here it creates this really cool looking cube. I'm gonna turn down the lighting just a little tad. The issue, obviously, is that it has a lot of roughness to it. So it kind of creates like that weird fogginess to it. And we don't want that. So, I mean, maybe you do. I don't know. I personally don't want it. So the way to get rid of that is by going to here on reflection and removing roughness from reflection. And this kind of creates like a cube, sort of like glass thing, which could look cool. And like I like the refractions and stuff. But if you want it to look more like just like windows, you can just go here to thin walled, and it will just turn them into little windows. Pretty much that is all you have to do to make a Hypercube. Alright, so that is the tutorial. You may have noticed that it kind of stuttered there at the end, but that's because OBS and Redshift sometimes don't get along, so I apologize. But, you know, I feel like you got the general gist of it. So anyways, yeah, so I hope this was like really informative. You know, like I've actually made this particular object like so many times. If you had actually seen what I did originally for my first ever attempt at this, it was so inefficient, and it was like, it looked fine, but so many objects that had aligned to spline tags. Then I tried making like my own little rig using Xpresso. It was a whole thing. It's just so much easier to do it with a cloner, and the fact that I was able to find that data node and like figure out a way to use it in this particular project was so helpful. Yeah, I hope y'all were able to learn something new, maybe something about Xpresso, maybe the weld tool, whatever it was. I hope you came away with something. At the very least, you come away with a cool looking animation. So if you do post, tag me, let me know. I would like to see it. I'll probably reshare it. Anyways, I'll catch you later.